Dawn's fog across the Bosphorus and the roar of colossal bronze artillery. During the springtime of 1453, early morning fog drifted away from the Bosphorus, unveiling a spectacle that would forever torment the visions of kings and caliphs. Spanning the distant skyline, an ocean of standards and lances reflected the first rays of sunlight, while the deafening blast of enormous bronze artillery shattered the peaceful morning. This wasn't simply another military encirclement. This represented the closing chapter of a saga that had been playing out across more than 10 centuries. Byzantium's final ruler positioned himself atop fortifications that had remained unconquered, confronting an adversary whose hunger for conquest recognized no limits. The events that transpired would transform civilization, conclude an imperial dynasty that had survived longer than Rome itself, and kindle fires that would blaze across history's chronicles. The year 1453 wasn't selected through mere chance. During this period, the Byzantine realm had diminished to barely more than a phantom, a specter of the formidable dominion that had previously controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Where monarchs had formerly governed lands extending from the Danube to Syria's arid regions, Constantine XI now administered a metropolis and dispersed islands. Constantinople's inhabitants had plummeted from 400,000 residents during its prosperous era to scarcely 50,000 frightened citizens clustered inside the imposing Theodosian fortifications. These historic ramparts constructed during the 5th century had safeguarded the metropolis through innumerable encirclements. Yet presently they surrounded not a flourishing city, but an assemblage of settlements divided by vacant terrain and deteriorating monuments. Nevertheless, even while declining, Constantinople persisted as the treasure every warrior desired. Commanding the Bosphorus signified supremacy across the commercial pathways linking Europe with Asia. The metropolis's tactical location rendered it the gateway to dual continents, and whosoever possessed Constantinople could control the movement of merchandise, knowledge, and military forces between Orient and Occident. For the youthful Ottoman ruler Mehmed, seizing this historic capital represented not merely a martial goal. It embodied his predetermined fate. Mehmed stood at merely 21 years when he directed his ambitions toward the metropolis that had resisted Ottoman strength for generations. Yet youthfulness didn't equate to naivety. The Sultan had received an empire during its zenith, controlling assets and innovations that the Byzantines could merely fantasize about. More significantly, he held something his forebears had been missing: the foresight to recognize that Constantinople wasn't merely another metropolis requiring conquest, but the emblem of authority that would elevate the Ottomans from accomplished marauders into Rome's genuine successors. When Mehmed proclaimed himself Caesar of Romans, it wasn't hollow arrogance. It represented a strategic assertion to imperial inheritance that surpassed religious divisions. The Ottoman military apparatus that gathered beyond Constantinople during spring 1453 embodied the apex of medieval martial coordination. Contemporary scholars calculate that Mehmed controlled between 60 and 80,000 warriors, although certain period accounts exaggerated the figures beyond 200,000. The foundation of this military consisted of the Janissaries, an exceptional force unlike any other global army. These represented Christian youth seized from their households in the Balkans, converted to Islam, and conditioned from youth to become flawless combatants. They recognized no allegiance besides the Sultan, no terror except dishonoring their unit, and no objective except triumph. Marching beside them came irregulars and hired fighters from throughout the Ottoman territories, forming a multicultural army that communicated countless dialects, yet possessed a unified aspiration. What genuinely distinguished this encirclement wasn't the Ottoman military's magnitude, but the groundbreaking innovations they transported with them. For the first occasion in recorded events, a besieging military wielded firepower sufficiently potent to transform the mightiest fortifications into debris. The individual accountable for this revolution was neither Turkic nor Muslim, but a Hungarian craftsman called Urban, whose tale exposes the intricate devotions and changing partnerships that characterized the late medieval period. Urban had initially presented his capabilities to the Byzantines. In 1452, this expert cannon architect appeared in Constantinople, pursuing his prosperity at the royal palace. Emperor Constantine immediately recognized interest in what the Hungarian provided. Bronze artillery embodied advanced martial innovation, and Constantine comprehended their possible worth. Yet comprehending and purchasing represent distinct matters. The Byzantine coffers stood depleted. The emperor's compensation to Urban arrived sporadically, and as weeks elapsed, the master artisan discovered himself impoverished in a metropolis that couldn't reward his abilities. When Urban ultimately departed Constantinople and traveled to the Ottoman palace, he encountered a vastly contrasting welcome. Sultan Mehmed not merely received the craftsman, but provided him quadruple what he had requested from the Byzantines. Granted limitless funding and resources, Urban commenced developing armaments that would transform siege combat permanently. The most renowned of these stood the colossal cannon designated Basilica, a bronze giant measuring 27 feet in length that demanded 60 oxen for transportation and 400 soldiers to manage. When Mehmed questioned whether such armaments could penetrate Constantinople's fortifications, Urban's answer proved ominous. He declared that his artillery could demolish not merely the Theodosian ramparts, but Babylon's legendary walls themselves. The paradox proved brutal and absolute, the armaments that would annihilate. Constantinople had initially been presented to its protectors. The Byzantines acknowledged advanced artillery's significance, yet possessed insufficient assets to obtain it. The Ottomans, enriched with their expanding empire's prosperity, could compensate generously for the newest martial breakthroughs. This financial truth perfectly illustrated the essential disparity between both powers. One represented an ascending empire possessing limitless determination and wealth. The other a diminishing remnant grasping at bygone magnificence it could no longer maintain. As winter transitioned to spring in 1453, both factions readied themselves for the confrontation everyone anticipated was approaching. The Byzantines labored desperately to reinforce their protections, while communications departed throughout Christian Europe, pleading for assistance that would never materialize. The Western continent's dominant forces remained too absorbed with their personal disputes to allocate substantial armies for a remote metropolis that numerous considered already defeated. Several hundred Genoese volunteers commanded by Giovanni Giustiniani supplied appreciated support, yet they couldn't modify the encirclement's essential mathematics. Constantine XI Palaiologos confronted the advancing tempest with the composure appropriate for Byzantium's final emperor. Born in 1404, he had received what scholars would subsequently describe as a catastrophic legacy. The empire he commanded consisted of minimal more than Constantinople itself and fragmented lands that could scarcely sustain themselves, much less aid the metropolis's protection. Nevertheless, Constantine never genuinely contemplated deserting his capital. To escape would signify the conclusion not simply of his sovereignty, but of an imperial heritage that extended back across a millennium to the metropolis's establishment by Constantine the Great. The emperor's modest military mirrored the empire's diminished situation. According to the Greek chronicler George S. Francis, who observed these occurrences personally, the defending military totaled under 5,000 soldiers. This proved woefully insufficient to garrison the 19 kilometers of ramparts safeguarding the metropolis. Even more disturbing, the once formidable Byzantine navy had contracted to merely 26 vessels, most belonging to Italian traders rather than the empire itself. Against this insufficient military, the Ottomans could deploy not merely their enormous army, but additionally a naval force exceeding 100 ships that granted them authority over the maritime approaches to the metropolis. As April materialized and the Ottoman multitude assumed its stations around Constantinople, the foundation was established for an encirclement that would decide far beyond than a singular metropolis's destiny. The protectors who garrisoned the historic ramparts understood they faced overwhelming numerical and technological disadvantage, yet they additionally understood they battled for something transcending themselves. They represented the final custodians of an empire that had maintained Roman legislation, Greek scholarship, and Christian belief through centuries of barbarian incursions and Muslim conquests. The Ottoman artillery spoke initially, their sounds reverberating throughout the Golden Horn like celestial fury from an enraged deity. On April 6, the enormous guns commenced firing, and with each thunderous discharge, fragments of historic stone departed from the Theodosian ramparts like foliage before a tempest. The sound proved unlike anything the protectors had previously experienced. Where earlier encirclements had been characterized by sword clashing against shield and arrows whistling, this bombardment introduced a novel form of dread. The ground itself appeared to tremble with each strike, and the atmosphere itself thickened with particulate matter and gunpowder's harsh odor. Urban's crowning achievement, the enormous basilica cannon, demonstrated as catastrophic as its inventor had guaranteed. The colossal bronze cylinder hurled 600-pound stone spheres with such intensity that they punctured through ramparts that had remained unconquered for a millennium. Yet the armament proved as hazardous to its handlers as to its objectives. The incredible recoil fractured the cannon's bronze structure after each discharge, demanding continuous restoration. Loading the giant demanded 3 hours of exhausting toil, and the projectiles themselves proved so costly to manufacture that each discharge represented a considerable expenditure. Nevertheless, despite these constraints, the mental influence proved enormous. The protectors observed with dread as portions of their seemingly impenetrable fortifications disintegrated to wreckage. The sequence that manifested would characterize the complete encirclement. Each sunrise introduced renewed bombardment as the Ottoman firepower methodically hammered chosen portions of the rampart. When openings materialized, assault forces would surge ahead, merely to encounter frantic Byzantine protectors who battled with the intensity of soldiers safeguarding their dwellings. As nightfall descended, both factions would retreat to address their injuries, and the Byzantines would commence the draining labor of restoring the destruction. Utilizing wreckage, lumber, soil, and whatever resources they could salvage, the protectors toiled through darkness to seal the openings, recognizing that sunrise would deliver fresh bombardment and novel gaps to repair. For the civilians confined inside the metropolis, existence transformed into a torment of perpetual terror and hardship. Households clustered in underground chambers and sanctuaries as projectiles crashed through rooftops and demolished centuries-old structures. Provisions grew limited as the encirclement intensified, and every capable individual, irrespective of age or gender, was compelled into duty, transporting stones, water, and munitions to the ramparts. Youngsters who had never experienced warfare learned to evade at the whistle of approaching projectiles, while their seniors discussed in subdued voices regarding prophecies and portents that appeared to predict the metropolis's destruction. The protectors themselves represented a diverse military that mirrored Constantinople's cosmopolitan nature. Alongside the remaining Byzantine combatants battled Genoese traders who had selected to remain and protect their chosen homeland. Venetian mariners deserted their vessels to garrison the ramparts, while Greek civilians grasped weapons for their existence's first occasion. Giovanni Giustiniani, the expert combatant from Genoa, demonstrated invaluable in coordinating the protection and sustaining spirits during the bleakest moments. His expertise and strategic understanding helped optimize the modest defending military's effectiveness. Yet even his proficiency couldn't surmount the essential disparity in quantities and assets. As the encirclement progressed into its subsequent week, Sultan Mehmed exhibited the strategic adaptability that rendered Ottoman military so formidable. Aggravated by the terrestrial protection's resilience, he redirected his focus toward the Golden Horn, the organic harbor safeguarding Constantinople's northern boundary. The Byzantines had extended a colossal chain throughout the harbor's entrance, blocking Ottoman vessels from accessing these sheltered waters. Yet Mehmed had examined the landscape meticulously and conceived a resolution that would achieve legendary status for its boldness and creativity. April 22nd, 70 vessels transported across terrain into the Golden Horn. On April 22nd's evening, Ottoman craftsmen initiated one of military chronicle's most extraordinary achievements. Laboring beneath darkness's concealment, they erected a pathway of lubricated timber extending from the Bosphorus upward and across Pira's elevation and downward to the Golden Horn's coastline. Subsequently, utilizing human effort and oxen combined, they commenced dragging their vessels across terrain. By sunrise, exceeding 70 Ottoman ships had been conveyed across solid ground and deployed into the harbor beyond the Byzantine protections. The mental influence of observing adversary vessels where none should have existed proved crushing to the protectors. The Byzantines had relied upon the Golden Horn as a protected sanctuary where their remaining vessels could function securely. Presently, Ottoman ships patrolled these waters, menacing the maritime ramparts that proved far less imposing than the terrestrial fortifications. Additionally worse, adversary vessels' existence in the harbor signified that the protectors had to disperse their already insufficient military even more thinly, garrisoning stations they had never anticipated protecting. Emperor Constantine absorbed this information with the dignified composure that had characterized his complete sovereignty. Positioned atop the ramparts as Ottoman vessels maneuvered freely in waters his predecessors had dominated for centuries, he must have comprehended that the constraint was constricting. Nevertheless, he displayed no indication of despair or terror. Rather, he circulated among his soldiers with tranquil authority, providing encouragement and experiencing the hazards that confronted every protector. Unlike numerous medieval monarchs who directed from secure distances, Constantine battled alongside his combatants, his purple footwear stained with the identical particulate matter and blood that characterized every soldier on the ramparts. The Ottoman bombardment persisted ruthlessly day following day, week following week. The enormous guns had been stationed at meticulously computed intervals throughout the terrestrial ramparts, establishing a methodical destruction sequence that rendered no portion unharmed. Mehmed had absorbed from earlier encirclements that focused fire proved more productive than dispersed bombardment. Rather than attempting to penetrate the ramparts at numerous locations concurrently, he concentrated his firepower on particular portions, pulverizing them thoroughly before advancing to the subsequent objective. This systematic methodology optimized each discharge's influence while preserving the valuable gunpowder and munitions that maintained his artillery firing. By early May, the pressure was manifesting on both factions. The Ottoman military had been positioned beyond Constantinople for exceeding a month, and sustaining such a substantial military in the terrain proved enormously expensive. Provisions had to be conveyed from throughout the empire, and the combatants themselves were becoming agitated for either conclusive triumph or lucrative plunder. Certain of Mehmed's counselors advocated patience, contending that the metropolis would ultimately capitulate when starvation compelled the protectors to yield. Others pressed an immediate offensive, believing that the ramparts had been adequately compromised to permit a penetration. For the Byzantines, each elapsing day transported them nearer to absolute depletion. The protectors had been battling without respite, restoring ramparts by darkness and garrisoning them by daylight. Their quantities were diminishing as losses accumulated and no prospect of support existed. Provision reserves were depleting, and the perpetual pressure of bombardment was exacting its toll on civilian spirits. Nevertheless, still, they persisted, propelled by a combination of desperation, obligation, and the recognition that capitulation would signify the conclusion of everything they had battled to maintain. The spiritual dimension of the encirclement amplified as both factions pursued divine blessing for their cause. In Constantinople, masses assembled daily in the Hagia Sophia to petition for salvation, while clergy conducted ceremonies around the ramparts transporting precious icons and relics. The magnificent sanctuary had transformed into a refuge for those excessively young, excessively aged, or excessively frail to battle. Yet it additionally functioned as the resistance's spiritual nucleus. Here underneath the ascending dome that had stimulated wonder for nearly a millennium, Byzantium's final protectors pursued strength from their belief. In the Ottoman encampment, the environment proved distinctly contrasting. Mehmed himself conducted prayers in the elaborate structures that had transformed the landscape around Constantinople into a textile metropolis of silk and hide. The Sultan's assurance remained undiminished despite the extended resistance. To him, the encirclement represented not merely a martial operation, but a sacred conflict that would crown his sovereignty with magnificence. His combatants embraced this conviction, maintained by the guarantee of 3 days of unlimited plunder once the metropolis collapsed. This represented the customary compensation for a triumphant encirclement, and the anticipation of Byzantine wealth and Christian captives maintained Ottoman spirits elevated even as the weeks prolonged. Nevertheless, underneath the surface assurance, pragmatic anxieties troubled the Ottoman leadership. The enormous artillery that had guaranteed swift triumph were demonstrating both advantage and burden. While they could indeed demolish historic stone, they devoured tremendous quantities of gunpowder and demanded perpetual maintenance. Urban himself had transformed into a captive of his personal invention, laboring frantically to restore the bronze giants that fractured and separated under their personal tremendous intensity. The Hungarian craftsman's vitality was deteriorating under the pressure, and speculations circulated through the encampment that the expert cannon architect was commencing to question whether his armaments could provide the conclusive penetration the Sultan required. The initial significant emergency materialized when a portion of the basilica cannon ultimately surrendered thoroughly. The colossal bronze cylinder, subjected to weeks of punishing recoil, manifested a fracture that rendered it worthless. Ottoman craftsmen labored frantically to forge a substitute, yet the intricate metallurgy demanded valuable time that Mehmed could inadequately accommodate. Each day of postponement signified additional expenses, additional agitated combatants, and additional prospects for Christian support to materialize from the Occident. The Sultan's intelligence operatives had already disclosed that Genoese and Venetian naval forces were being constructed, though whether they would materialize sufficiently early to influence the encirclement remained ambiguous. For Constantine, the temporary decrease in bombardment supplied a brief reprieve, yet he comprehended that it was probably the tranquility preceding an even greater tempest. The emperor utilized these valuable hours to reinforce the most compromised portions of the rampart and redistribute his diminishing military to shield the most exposed locations. His commanders disclosed daily regarding their protection's condition, and the information proved uniformly bleak. Munitions were depleting. The civilian inhabitants were approaching starvation, and numerous foreign volunteers were commencing to murmur about escape by maritime. The emperor's reaction to these difficulties exposed the character that would render him legendary. Rather than retreating to the palace's security, Constantine devoted his days traversing the ramparts, conversing personally with combatants and civilians alike. He divided their meager provisions, rested in the identical crude shelters, and exposed himself to the identical hazards that menaced every protector. When Ottoman marksmen targeted the ramparts, the emperor declined to wear distinctive royal attire that might render him a more appealing objective. His purple footwear and simple armor characterized him as a combatant primarily and an emperor secondarily. This personal command had a significant effect on spirits throughout the metropolis. Where other monarchs might have pursued to negotiate or escape, Constantine's visible existence on the battlements transmitted a transparent message that the emperor would experience whatever destiny awaited his populace. Accounts circulated through the ranks of how the emperor had personally assisted transporting stones to restore a breach, or how he had consoled injured combatants in the improvised infirmaries that occupied the metropolis's sanctuaries. These demonstrations of common humanity elevated Constantine from a remote figurehead to a cherished commander who personified the essence of Byzantine resistance. Mehmed's concluding strategy, focus fire, deploy the Janissaries. As May advanced, both factions commenced readying for what everyone perceived would be the encirclement's concluding phase. Mehmed's craftsmen had fulfilled restorations to the compromised artillery and fabricated supplementary pieces that elevated the total Ottoman firepower to an unprecedented magnitude. The Sultan himself assumed personal command of positioning these armaments, computing angles and distances with a master strategist's exactness. His strategy proved brutally straightforward. Focus overwhelming firepower on a singular rampart portion until it disintegrated thoroughly. Subsequently pour his exceptional janissaries through the opening before the protectors could react. The selected objective was the terrestrial rampart's middle portion, where earlier bombardments had already compromised the historic stones. Here the Theodosian fortifications ascended in a succession of concentric obstacles that had safeguarded Constantinople for exceeding a millennium. The exterior rampart stood 40 feet elevated, supported by a subsequent rampart that ascended even higher with colossal towers interrupting the complete length. Beyond these protections existed a concluding obstacle, the interior rampart that characterized the final boundary of Byzantine resistance. Mehmed comprehended that if he could penetrate all three obstacles concurrently, the resulting opening would prove excessively broad for the protectors to seal. The mental combat amplified as both militaries readied for the climactic confrontation. Ottoman percussion instruments thundered day and darkness, accompanied by the unsettling wailing of wind instruments that traveled throughout the ramparts like demonic voices. This dissonance was intended to disturb the protectors and block them from obtaining sufficient respite. The Ottomans additionally exhibited the severed heads of imprisoned Byzantine combatants on spears, a horrifying reminder of what awaited those who persisted in resisting. At darkness, thousands of flames transformed the Ottoman encampment into an ocean of wavering illuminations that could be observed from every Constantinople section, emphasizing the overwhelming quantities arrayed against the metropolis. The Byzantines reacted with their personal mental strategies, though their assets were far more constrained. Sanctuary bells rang perpetually, summoning the faithful to prayer and reminding the protectors that they battled not merely for an earthly metropolis, but for their eternal spirits. Icons and spiritual standards materialized on every rampart portion, transforming the fortifications into a form of sacred obstacle between Christianity and Islam. Clergy circulated among the combatants, providing absolution and guaranteeing that those who perished protecting the metropolis would be received directly into paradise. Inside the Hagia Sophia, the environment grew progressively apocalyptic, as civilians and combatants alike assembled for what numerous believed might be their concluding ceremonies. The magnificent sanctuary with its ascending dome and sparkling mosaics had observed the prayers of emperors and patriarchs for nearly 900 years. Presently it sheltered refugees from throughout the metropolis, their whispered prayers combining with the remote thunder of Ottoman artillery. Youngsters who had never recognized existence without the encirclement participated quietly in the shadows of historic columns, while their parents grasped precious belongings and contemplated whether sunrise would transport salvation or annihilation. The international community observed these occurrences transpire with a combination of captivation and dread. Venetian and Genoese traders who had resided in Constantinople for generations discovered themselves divided between commercial interests and spiritual devotion. Some selected to remain and battle alongside the Byzantines, while others discreetly arranged to evacuate their households and valuables before the concluding offensive. The Italian city-states had prospered from commerce with both Christians and Muslims, and they comprehended that Constantinople's collapse would essentially modify the Eastern Mediterranean's power equilibrium. Disclosures from the encirclement reached Western Europe through various channels, generating a sensation in palaces from London to Naples. The representation of the final Christian emperor positioned alone against the Islamic conquest tide captured imaginations throughout the continent. Nevertheless, this romantic captivation translated into minimal pragmatic assistance. The dominant powers remained too absorbed with their personal disputes to organize a genuine relief expedition, and the smaller territories possessed insufficient assets to create a meaningful distinction. Several individual knights and adventurers completed the journey to Constantinople, yet their quantities were insignificant compared to the colossal Ottoman multitude. The concluding preparations exposed the stark contrast between the dual militaries. The Ottomans maneuvered with the assurance of a military that had conquered most of southeastern Europe, their ranks occupied with veterans who had participated in countless triumphant encirclements. Their equipment proved standardized and well-preserved, their provision channels secure, and their spirits elevated by a continuous sequence of triumphs. The Ottoman military's diversity actually represented a strength source, as distinct ethnic communities contributed specialized capabilities and combat techniques that rendered the military more flexible and productive. May 29th, the concluding offensive commences at sunrise. And thus on May 29th, as the initial daylight of sunrise emerged across the Bosphorus, the concluding offensive commenced. When the particulate matter resolved and the final sword descended silent, an empire that had persisted for exceeding a millennium existed in devastation. Constantine XI had collapsed with his metropolis. His remains disappeared among the innumerable deceased who had selected honor beyond survival. Constantinople collapses. The empire era is regenerated in flames. The flames that devoured Constantinople that day characterized more than Byzantium's conclusion. They indicated the emergence of a novel world arrangement where gunpowder would transform warfare's craft and the Ottoman Empire would position as the connection between Orient and Occident. The encirclement that shattered empire had in its annihilation forged the future.